The notification sound from my phone cut through the silence of my studio apartment at exactly 7:43 a.m. I'd been awake for hours anyway, staring at the ceiling and replaying the last conversation I'd had with my grandfather 3 months ago. The message was from a number I didn't recognize, but the words made my blood run cold. Miss Rachel Martinez, your presence is requested at the reading of Theodore Martinez's last will and testament. Today, 3 p.m. Urgent. I read it 3 times before it sank in. Grandpa Ted had been dead for 2 weeks, and this was the first I'd heard about any will reading. The first I'd heard about anything. Actually, my own family had shut me out so completely that I'd found out about his death from his obituary in the local newspaper. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The law firm of Henderson and Associates sat on the corner of 5th and Main in downtown Portland, Oregon, housed in a gleaming glass building that seemed to pierce the overcast sky. I'd driven past it countless times on my way to my job at the community center, never imagining I'd one day be walking through its marble lobby, my worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Everything about this felt wrong. For the past 8 months, I'd been the family pariah, the ungrateful granddaughter who dared to question the Martinez family's golden reputation. It had started innocently enough, a casual comment at last year's Christmas dinner about how strange it was that Grandpa Ted's assisted living facility seemed so understaffed and run down despite charging premium rates, how the residents always seemed confused about their medication schedules, how the food looked questionable, how the staff turnover was constant. That comment had sparked something I never expected. A family war. My uncle Roberto, who managed Grandpa's finances and had recommended Sunset Manor, had turned red as a Christmas ornament. Rachel always has something negative to say, he'd muttered, stabbing at his turkey with unnecessary force. Never satisfied, always causing drama, but I couldn't let it go. Over the following weeks, I'd started visiting Grandpa more frequently, and what I saw disturbed me deeply. The facility was clearly cutting corners everywhere. Residents were left sitting in their own waste for hours. Meals were often forgotten or arrived cold. The supposed 24-hour medical care consisted of one overwhelmed nurse for 60 residents during night shifts. When I'd tried to bring up my concerns with the family, suggesting we look into other facilities for Grandpa, the response had been swift and brutal. My Aunt Carmen had accused me of trying to stir up trouble and undermine Roberto's excellent care decisions. My cousin Diego had laughed and said I was just jealous that I couldn't afford to contribute to Grandpa's care costs, so I was trying to sabotage everyone else's effort. The breaking point came when I discovered that Sunset Manor had been cited multiple times by the state for health violations, and that Roberto was receiving a substantial finder's fee for every family member he referred to the facility. When I confronted him with the documentation I'd found through a public records request, he'd exploded. "You ungrateful little brat," he'd screamed in front of the entire family during what was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday dinner. "After everything this family has done for you, this is how you repay us? By trying to destroy my reputation with lies and conspiracy theories." I'd stood my ground even as my hands shook. "These aren't lies, Uncle Roberto. These are state inspection reports. Grandpa deserves better than this place, and you know it." That's when my Aunt Carmen had played her trump card. "Theodore is getting confused in his old age," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "He's been saying some very strange things lately about people trying to hurt him, about his family not caring about him. The doctors say it's early-stage dementia, and they warned us that sometimes patients start to distrust the people closest to them." My cousin Sophia nodded sagely. "It's so sad when elderly people start turning against their own families." The staff at Sunset Manor mentioned that Rachel has been visiting a lot lately, getting Grandpa all agitated with her questions and complaints. I'd felt the ground shift beneath my feet as I realized what was happening. They were painting me as the problem, the troublemaker who was confusing and upsetting an elderly man with dementia. And because I was the youngest family member, recently graduated from college and working for a nonprofit instead of pursuing a real career like my cousins, my voice carried no weight. The final blow came when Roberto announced that he was implementing new visiting restrictions for Grandpa's mental health and stability. Family members would need to coordinate visits through him to ensure that Grandpa wasn't getting overwhelmed or confused by too much stimulation. Somehow, my name never made it onto the approved visitor list. When I'd shown up at Sunset Manor the following week, I was told that Theodore Martinez was not accepting visitors, and that his family had specifically requested that I not be allowed to see him. The security guard, a kind-faced woman named Betty, had looked genuinely sorry as she'd turned me away. "I'm really sorry, honey," she'd whispered. "But your uncle was very clear. He said you were causing problems and upsetting your grandfather." I'd tried calling, but the facility's phone system somehow never connected me to Grandpa's room. I'd tried reaching out to my family members, but my calls went straight to voicemail and my texts went unanswered. I'd even written letters to Grandpa, but I had no way of knowing if he ever received them. For 8 months, I'd been completely cut off from the man who'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. Grandpa Ted had been my everything. My father figure, my biggest supporter, my best friend. He'd taught me to play chess, helped me with my homework, and walked me down the aisle at my high school graduation when I was valedictorian. He'd been so proud when I'd gotten into Portland State University, and even prouder when I'd graduated with honors and took a job at the community center helping at-risk youth. But according to my family, I was the villain in this story, the ungrateful granddaughter who'd turned against her own relatives, who'd tried to destroy the family's reputation with malicious lies about Roberto's business practices. They'd closed ranks against me so completely that I'd started to wonder if I really was the problem. The doubt had eaten at me for months. Maybe I had been too quick to judge. Maybe I'd misunderstood the situation at Sunset Manor. Maybe Grandpa really was developing dementia, and I'd been too stubborn to accept it. Maybe my family was right and I was just a troublemaker who couldn't appreciate everything they'd done for Grandpa. But then I'd received the call from Mrs. Patterson at the community center. She'd been crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. "Rachel, honey, I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this," she'd sobbed. "But Theodore Martinez passed away yesterday. I saw it in the obituary this morning, and I knew you'd want to know." The funeral had been held 3 days later, and I'd only found out about it because Miss Patterson had seen the announcement in the newspaper. I stood in the back of the church, trying to be invisible, watching my family grieve for the man I'd loved more than anyone else in the world. They'd acted like I wasn't even there, like I was a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. The eulogy Roberto had given painted a picture of a devoted family who'd done everything possible to ensure Theodore's comfort and happiness in his final year. He'd mentioned the difficult decisions they'd had to make about his care, the heartbreaking progression of his dementia, the blessing of having such a loving, supportive family during his final months. He'd never mentioned me at all. I'd slipped out before the burial, unable to bear watching them lower Grandpa into the ground while pretending I'd never existed. I'd driven to the cemetery later that night and stood by his grave in the darkness, finally allowing myself to cry for the first time since I'd heard about his death. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," I whispered to the freshly turned earth. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry I let them win." Now, standing in the marble lobby of Henderson and Associates, I felt that same crushing weight of guilt and grief. Why had I been invited to this reading? It had to be some kind of mistake, or maybe even a cruel joke. Maybe my family wanted to make sure I understood exactly how completely I'd been erased from Grandpa's life. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt like an eternity. My reflection in the polished steel doors showed a 26-year-old woman who looked like she'd aged 5 years in the past 8 months. My dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and I was wearing the only professional outfit I owned, a navy blue dress I'd bought at a thrift store for job interview. Next to my family's designer clothes and expensive accessories, I'd always felt like a pretender, and today was no different. The receptionist, a perfectly coiffed blonde woman who looked like she belonged in a magazine, barely glanced up when I gave her my name. "Conference room C," she said, pointing down a hallway lined with oil paintings and mahogany doors. "They're waiting for you." As I walked down the hall, I could hear voices coming from behind one of the doors. Familiar voices that made my stomach clench with anxiety and old hurt. "This is ridiculous." Carmen's voice carried clearly through the heavy wood. "Why would Dad include her in his will? She hasn't been part of this family for almost a year. Maybe he mentioned her before the dementia got worse, Roberto replied. You know how confused he was getting toward the end. Well, whatever it is, it can't be much. Diego's voice was full of his usual smugness. Probably just some sentimental trinket, a photo or his old chess set or something. Sophia laughed, the sound sharp and mean. God, could you imagine if he left her something valuable, after everything she put him through, after all the stress she caused him? I stood frozen outside the door, their words hitting me like physical blows. Even now, even after Grandpa's death, they couldn't resist painting me as the villain, the ungrateful granddaughter who'd stressed out an elderly man with dementia. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door and stepped into the conference room. The conversation stopped immediately, and 5 pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from surprise to outright hostility. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Roberto sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expensive suit immaculate. At 62, he looked like what he was, a successful businessman who'd built a small empire of medical facilities and real estate investments. Carmen sat to his right, her jewelry catching the light from the massive windows that overlooked the city. She was 2 years younger than Roberto but looked older, her face tight with years of practiced disapproval. Diego and Sophia sat across from each other, both in their early 30s and both looking like they'd stepped out of a catalog for young professionals. Diego had inherited Roberto's business acumen and ran 3 urgent care clinics across the city. Sophia was a successful real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties. And then there was me, the black sheep, the family disappointment, the granddaughter who'd chosen social work over business, who drove a 15-year-old Honda instead of a luxury car, who lived in a studio apartment instead of a mansion. Rachel, Roberto's voice was cold, formal. I'm surprised to see you here. I was invited, I said quietly, taking the only empty seat at the far end of the table. I got a text this morning. Carmen's eyes narrowed. By whom? We specifically told Mr. Henderson that you weren't to be included in any family business. Before I could respond, the door opened again, and a distinguished-looking man in his 70s entered the room. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and his gray hair was neatly combed back. He carried a leather briefcase and several thick folders. I'm James Henderson, he said, setting his materials on the table. I apologize for the delay. I wanted to make sure all the necessary parties were present before we began. Roberto leaned forward. Mr. Henderson, there seems to be some confusion. My niece Rachel isn't supposed to be here. She's been estranged from the family for months. My father was very clear about that. Mr. Henderson opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick document. I understand. There's been some family tension. Mr. Martinez, however, I'm obligated to follow the explicit instructions in your father's will. Rachel Martinez is specifically named as a beneficiary, and her presence is required for the reading. The room fell silent. I could feel my family's eyes on me, could sense their confusion and growing anger. Part of me wanted to shrink into my chair, to apologize for being there, to leave before I caused any more trouble. But another part of me, the part that had loved Grandpa Ted more than anything, wanted to know what he'd left me. Even if it was just a photo or his old chess set, it would mean the world to me. It would mean that he'd remembered me, that he'd loved me even after my family had convinced him I was the enemy. Well, Carmen said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, I suppose we should get this over with. What did Dad leave for Rachel? His collection of old books, his fishing gear. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me. Actually, Mrs. Rodriguez, your father left Rachel quite a bit more than that. And in that moment, I knew that everything I thought I understood about my family, about Grandpa's final months, about my place in the Martinez legacy, was about to change forever. Mr. Henderson's words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything. I thought I knew. The silence in the conference room was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of traffic from the street below. "What exactly do you mean by quite a bit more?" Roberto's voice had an edge to it that I'd never heard before. His usual commanding presence seemed to falter, and I noticed his hands gripping the edge of the table. Mr. Henderson pulled out a pair of reading glasses and placed them carefully on his nose. "Before we proceed with the specific bequests, I should mention that Mr. Theodore Martinez came to see me approximately 6 weeks before his death. He was accompanied by Dr. Tricia Reeves, a geriatric psychiatrist, who conducted a comprehensive mental capacity evaluation." Carmen's face went pale. "That's impossible. Dad had dementia." He was confused, agitated. "The doctors at Sunset Manor confirmed it. I have Dr. Reeves' full report here," Mr. Henderson said, tapping a thick folder. "She found Mr. Martinez to be of completely sound mind with no signs of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other cognitive impairment. In fact, her exact words were that he was remarkably sharp and clear-thinking for a man of his age." The room erupted in protests. Diego slammed his hand on the table. "That's ridiculous. He was seeing things, talking to people who weren't there. He kept saying we were trying to hurt him." "He was paranoid," Sophia added quickly. "Always accusing the staff of stealing from him, claiming his medication was being switched. Classic signs of mental deterioration." Mr. Henderson opened another folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Mr. Martinez was indeed concerned about his treatment at Sunset Manor. So concerned, in fact, that he hired a private investigator to document what was happening there. The words hit the room like a physical blow. I watched my family's faces change from confusion to dawning horror as the implications sank in. "He documented everything," Mr. Henderson continued, his voice steady and professional. "The understaffing, the medication errors, the neglect of residents. He also discovered some very interesting financial arrangements between certain family members in the facility's management." Roberto's face had gone from pale to gray. "This is preposterous. Dad was sick, confused. He was being manipulated." "By whom?" Mr. Henderson interrupted. "The only person who visited him regularly outside of supervised family visits was Rachel, and according to his notes, she was the only one who seemed genuinely concerned about his welfare. I felt like I was watching this happen to someone else. For 8 months, I'd been told that I was the problem, that I was the one causing trouble and upsetting Grandpa. Now I was learning that he'd been investigating the same concerns I'd raised, that he'd been documenting the very problems I'd tried to warn the family about." "He kept detailed journals," Mr. Henderson said, pulling out a leather-bound notebook. "Would you like me to read some excerpt?" "No," Carmen said quickly. "That's not necessary. Let's just get to reading." But Mr. Henderson was already opening the notebook. "March 15th, he read aloud. "Rachel came to visit today. She's the only one who looks me in the eye anymore, the only one who asks how I'm really doing instead of just nodding along with whatever the staff tells her. She's worried about the care here, and she's right to be. I've been keeping track of the medication errors, the missed meals, the way they rush through everything like we're cattle instead of people." His voice continued, calm and measured, as he read from Grandpa's own words. "March 22nd. Roberto came today with papers for me to sign. Said it was just routine paperwork for the facility, but I read every word. It's an authorization for them to increase my medication dosage without consulting an outside doctor. When I asked questions, he got irritated, said I was being difficult. He doesn't realize I've been checking my pills every day, documenting when they don't match what's supposed to be prescribed." Diego's face was flushed red. "You can't prove any of this." An old man's paranoid ramblings. March 30th, Mr. Henderson continued reading. "Had another visit from Carmen today. She seemed nervous, kept asking if I'd been talking to anyone outside the family. When I mentioned that Rachel had been asking good questions about my care, Carmen got upset. Said Rachel was stirring up trouble, that she was trying to cause problems for the family. But Rachel is the only one who's been asking the right questions." The notebook seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in Mr. Henderson's hands. April 8th. They've banned Rachel from visiting. Roberto said it was for my own good, that she was getting me agitated and confused. But I'm not confused. I'm angry. I'm angry that they think I'm too stupid to see what's happening. I'm angry that they've silenced the only person who was trying to help me. Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't care who saw them. For 8 months, I'd carried the weight of thinking I'd failed Grandpa, thinking I'd abandoned him when he needed me most. Now, I was learning that he'd understood everything, that he'd known I was trying to help him. "This is all very touching," Roberto said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "But it doesn't change the fact that Dad was deteriorating. These fantasies about private investigators and conspiracies." Mr. Henderson reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. "The private investigator's report," he said, setting it on the table. "Complete with photographs, video surveillance, and financial records." Mr. Martinez was very thorough. The envelope sat on the table like a bomb, waiting to explode. I could see the fear in my family's eyes now, the way they kept glancing at each other, the way their confident facades were crumbling. "Before we proceed with the will," Mr. Henderson said, "I think it's important that everyone understands the full scope of what Mr. Martinez discovered. The investigator found evidence of systematic neglect at Sunset Manor, including falsified medication records, inadequate staffing, and financial irregularities." He opened the envelope and pulled out several photographs. "These show residents left unattended for hours, medication errors that could have been fatal, and staff members who were supposed to be providing care but were instead in the break room or outside smoking. The photos were damning. I recognized several of the residents from my visits, elderly people who deserved dignity and care, but were instead being treated like inconveniences. The financial investigation was even more revealing." Mr. Henderson continued, "It seems that certain family members were receiving substantial payments from Sunset Manor in exchange for referrals. Not just Martinez, but other elderly residents whose families were convinced to move them to the facility." Roberto's hands were shaking now. "This is blackmail. You're trying to extort." "I'm simply reading from your father's will and explaining the context behind his decisions," Mr. Henderson said calmly. He wanted everyone to understand why he made the choices he did. He picked up the will and adjusted his glasses. Mr. Martinez was very specific about his wishes. He wanted to address each family member individually, to explain his reasoning for each bequest. Carmen leaned forward. "Just read the damn thing. We don't need explanations." "Actually, your father insisted on explanations. He said, and I quote, 'I want them to understand that every decision I made was deliberate and informed. I want them to know that I was not the confused old man they thought I was.'" Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and began to read. "To my son Roberto Martinez, who convinced me that Sunset Manor was the best choice for my care, I leave my collection of medical facility inspection reports from the past 5 years. May they serve as a reminder that profit should never come before the welfare of those who trust us with their lives." Roberto's face went white. "What inspection reports?" "Your father obtained public records from the state health department," Mr. Henderson explained. "Sunset Manor has been cited for violations in each of the past 5 years. The reports detail everything from medication errors to inadequate staffing, to falsified records." He continued reading. "To my daughter Carmen Martinez Rodriguez, who told me that questioning my care was a sign of mental decline, I leave my journals from the past year. In them you'll find detailed documentation of every conversation we had, every concern I raised, and every time you dismissed my worries as confusion or paranoia." Carmen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "He was recording our conversations." "Not recording," Mr. Henderson clarified, "writing detailed notes immediately after each visit. Very precise, very thorough. He had an excellent memory for detail. To my grandson Diego Martinez, who told me that Rachel was causing me stress and confusion, I left the medication logs I kept for 6 months. You'll find records of every pill I was given, every dose that was wrong, Every time I was given medication that wasn't prescribed for me. You'll also find the receipts for the home drug testing kit I used to verify what I was actually being given. Diego's face had gone ashen. Drug testing kit? That's paranoid behavior. To my granddaughter Sofia Martinez, who suggested that I needed to be protected from negative influences, I leave my correspondence with the state elder abuse hotline. You'll find copies of every report I filed, every concern I raised, and every time I was told that my family's word would be taken over mine because I was elderly and possibly confused. Sophia was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. Grandpa, we were trying to help you. And finally, Miss Anderson's voice rose slightly. To my granddaughter Rachel Martinez, who was the only one brave enough to tell the truth, who was the only one who loved me enough to risk family relationships for my welfare, who was the only one who saw me as a person rather than a problem to be managed. The room had gone completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel the weight of everyone's stares. I leave the remainder of my estate. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. The remainder, Roberto's voice was barely a whisper. Mr. Henderson consulted his papers. The house on Elm Street valued at $850,000. The vacation cabin in Bend, valued at $200,000. All bank accounts and investment portfolios, totaling approximately $2.3 million. The life insurance policies, worth $500,000, and the contents of safety deposit boxes at First National Bank, including jewelry, bonds, and other valuables estimated at $400,000. The explosion of voices was immediate and deafening. Carmen was shrieking about undue influence. Diego was shouting about mental incompetence. Sophia was crying and demanding to know how this was possible. Roberto was on his feet, pacing like a caged animal, muttering about lawyers and lawsuits and fraud. But I couldn't hear any of it clearly. The numbers were spinning in my head like a slot machine. Nearly $4 million. Properties, investments, insurance policies, a fortune that would change my life completely, that would allow me to quit my job at the community center, to start the nonprofit I'd always dreamed of, to help other elderly people who were being neglected and abused. This is impossible, Roberto was saying, his voice cutting through the chaos. Dad didn't have that much money. His medical bills, the facility costs. Your father was quite wealthy, Mr. Henderson said calmly. He'd been very successful in his construction business before he retired, and he'd made excellent investments over the years. He was also very careful about his finances, particularly after he became concerned about his care. We'll contest this, Carmen declared. Undue influence, mental incompetence, fraud. Rachel manipulated him, turned him against his own family. I wouldn't recommend that, Mr. Henderson said. Your father anticipated that possibility. He left very specific instructions about what should happen if anyone contests the will. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. He also left a video message explaining his decisions. He wanted everyone to understand his reasoning, to hear directly from him why he made these choices. The envelope sat on the table like a loaded gun. I could see the fear in my family's eyes, the way they were looking at each other, the way their anger was starting to turn to panic. Before we watch the video, Mr. Henderson said, I should mention that your father also made some other arrangements. He's established a trust fund for the legal defense of elderly abuse cases, with an initial endowment of. He's also made donations to several organizations that investigate elder abuse and neglect. He opened the envelope and pulled out a small device. He was very specific about wanting everyone to hear this message. He said it was important that there be no misunderstandings about his mental state or his intentions. As he set up the device, I caught sight of my family's faces. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Fear, desperation, and the dawning realization that they had underestimated the man they thought they'd controlled. Grandpa Ted's face appeared on the small screen, and my heart clenched. He looked tired but determined, sitting in what I recognized as his room at Sunset Manor. He was wearing the sweater I'd bought him for his birthday, the one Carmen had said was too expensive and impractical. "Hello, my dear ones," his voice filled the room, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from sobbing. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and you're all sitting in James Henderson's office wondering what the hell just happened." Even from beyond the grave, Grandpa Ted could make me smile. He'd always had a way of cutting through pretense and getting straight to the heart of things. "I imagine there are some very surprised faces in that room right now," he continued, his eyes twinkling with familiar mischief. "Especially Roberto and Carmen, who spent the last year of my life convinced that I was too senile to understand what was happening to me." The video continued, and I knew that everything I thought I understood about my family, about Grandpa's final months, about my place in the Martinez legacy, was about to be turned completely upside down. Grandpa Ted's voice filled the conference room with the warmth and clarity I remembered from countless conversations we'd shared over chess games and Sunday dinners. But there was something different in his tone now, a steel resolve that I'd never heard before, the voice of a man who'd made peace with difficult truths. "Let me start by addressing the elephant in the room," he said, leaning slightly toward the camera. "Carmen, Roberto, I know you've spent months telling everyone that I have dementia, that I'm confused and paranoid. I know you've used that story to justify keeping Rachel away from me, to explain away my concerns about Sunset Manor, and to convince yourselves that you're the heroes in this situation." Roberto shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Carmen had gone completely rigid, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. "But I want everyone in that room to understand something very clearly." Grandpa continued, his eyes seeming to look directly at each of us through the screen. "I am not now, nor have I ever been, suffering from dementia or any other form of cognitive decline. What I have been suffering from is the systematic abuse and neglect that you, Roberto, arranged for me by placing me in that hellhole you call a care facility." The room was dead silent except for the soft whir of the air conditioning. Even Diego and Sofia had stopped their whispered protests, transfixed by their grandfather's words. "I want to tell you a story," Grandpa said, settling back in his chair. "A story about what really happened during my last year of life, because I have a feeling you're going to hear a very different version from the people sitting around that table." He paused, and I could see him gathering his thoughts, choosing his words carefully. "It started 18 months ago when Roberto first suggested that I might be happier in an assisted living facility. At the time, I thought it was a reasonable suggestion. As I was getting older, the house was becoming harder to maintain, and I liked the idea of having medical care available if I needed it." My heart clenched as I remembered those conversations. I'd been away at college, finishing my degree, and I'd trusted my family to make good decisions for Grandpa. I'd even supported the idea initially, thinking it would give him companionship and professional care. Roberto presented Sunset Manor as the premium option. Grandpa continued. "Beautiful grounds, excellent staff, comprehensive medical care. The brochures were impressive, the tour was convincing, and the price seemed reasonable for what they were offering. What I didn't know at the time was that Roberto was receiving a $5,000 finder's fee for every resident he referred to." Carmen made a strangled sound, but Mr. Henderson held up a hand for silence. "I also didn't know that Sunset Manor had been operating with severe understaffing for over 2 years, that they'd been cited repeatedly for medication errors, or that their owner, Marcus Webb, was Roberto's college roommate and business partner in 3 other ventures. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture so ugly that I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't just about cutting corners or making mistakes. This was about deliberate exploitation of vulnerable elderly people for profit. "The first few weeks at Sunset Manor were tolerable," Grandpa said. "The problems were subtle at first. Meals that arrived cold or late, medication that didn't quite match what my doctor had prescribed, staff members who seemed rushed and overwhelmed." I mentioned these issues to Roberto during his visits, but he assured me that all facilities had adjustment periods, and that I was being overly critical. His expression darkened, but the problems got worse. Much worse. I started keeping track of when my medications were given, versus when they were supposed to be given. I documented every meal that was missed or delayed. I wrote down the names of staff members who left residents sitting in their own waste for hours at a time. I found myself leaning forward, hanging on every word. This was the grandpa I remembered. Methodical, thorough, unwilling to accept substandard treatment. When I tried to discuss these documented problems with Roberto and Carmen, they told me I was being difficult. They said that my expectations were unrealistic, that no facility was perfect, that I needed to be more grateful for the care I was receiving. When I insisted that some of the medication errors could have been dangerous, Carmen suggested that I was getting confused about what pills I was supposed to take. The camera captured every nuance of his expression, the hurt and betrayal that flickered across his weathered face. That's when I realized they weren't going to help me. In fact, they had a vested interest in keeping me at Sunset Manor, regardless of the quality of care. Roberto was making money from my placement there, and both he and Carmen had convinced themselves that any problems I reported were just the complaints of a difficult old man. He leaned forward again, his voice taking on an edge of anger. But then Rachel came to visit. My breath caught in my throat. After months of believing I'd failed him, abandoned him, caused him stress and confusion, hearing him say my name with such warmth and gratitude was almost overwhelming. From the moment Rachel walked into my room, I could see that she was really looking at me, really listening to what I was saying. When I told her about the medication errors, she didn't dismiss my concerns or suggest that I was confused. She asked intelligent questions. She took notes. She promised to look into things. Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't care who saw them. For the first time in 8 months, I felt like I could breathe again. Rachel was the first person to treat me like a competent adult instead of a problematic patient. Grandpa continued. She researched Sunset Manor's inspection history. She looked into the state regulations for assisted living facilities. She even spoke with other residents and their families to see if they were experiencing similar problems. I remembered those conversations, the sick feeling in my stomach as I'd realized how widespread the problems were. Mrs. Chen's daughter had mentioned medication mix-ups. Mr. Rodriguez's son had complained about his father losing weight because meals were frequently missed. Mrs. Williams had told her nephew that she felt unsafe at night because there was only one staff member for 60 residents. When Rachel brought these concerns to the family, she was doing exactly what a loving granddaughter should do, Grandpa said. His voice growing stronger. She was advocating for her grandfather's safety and well-being. She was asking the hard questions that everyone else was afraid to ask. Roberto's face had gone from gray to green. Carmen was crying silently, mascara streaming down her cheeks in dark rivulets. But instead of listening to Rachel, instead of investigating her concerns, the family closed ranks. They accused her of being a troublemaker. They said she was trying to destroy Roberto's reputation. They claimed she was upsetting me with her wild accusations and conspiracy theories. Grandpa's voice took on a tone of cold fury that I'd never heard from him before. And then they did something unforgivable. They used their lies about my mental state to cut Rachel off from me completely. They told Sunset Manor that I was confused and agitated, that Rachel was making my condition worse, that she should be banned from visiting for my own protection. The weight of those months crashed over me again. The helplessness, the grief, the constant second-guessing of my own perceptions and motivations. For 8 months, they kept the one person who truly cared about my welfare away from me. 8 months during which the problems at Sunset Manor continued to get worse. 8 months during which I was forced to endure substandard care while being told that any complaints I made were signs of mental deterioration. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet but deadly serious. Let me be very clear about something. The only person in this family who showed me genuine love and respect during my final year was Rachel. Everyone else treated me like an inconvenient burden, whose complaints needed to be managed rather than addressed. Sophia was sobbing openly now. Diego had his head in his hands. Carmen and Roberto looked like they were about to be sick. But I wasn't helpless, Grandpa continued, and I could see a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. I may have been old, but I wasn't stupid. I hired a private investigator. I obtained copies of all my medical records. I documented every instance of neglect and abuse. I built a case that would stand up in any court of law. Mr. Henderson opened one of his folders and pulled out a thick stack of photographs. I could see they were time-stamped surveillance photos showing various incidents at Sunset Manor. The investigator confirmed everything Rachel had suspected, and more, Grandpa said. Systematic understaffing, medication errors that could have been fatal, financial fraud, neglect that bordered on criminal abuse. And through it all, Roberto continued to collect his finder's fees, while Carmen insisted that any problems I reported were just manifestations of my declining mental state. The photos Mr. Henderson was spreading across the table painted a horrifying picture. Residents were left alone for hours, staff members sleeping on duty, medication carts left unattended, where confused residents could access dangerous drugs. I also discovered something else very interesting. Grandpa continued, his voice taking on that familiar tone he used when he was about to reveal the punchline of a long story. Roberto wasn't just getting finder's fees from Sunset Manor, he was also invested in the parent company that owns the facility. He had a financial stake in keeping occupancy rates high, regardless of the quality of care being provided. Roberto shot to his feet. "That's not. I never—" "Sit down, Roberto," Mr. Henderson said calmly. "Let your father finish." The investigator found the incorporation papers. Grandpa continued imperturbable. "Roberto owns 15% of Sunset Manor's parent company, Golden Years Healthcare Group. He's been profiting from my suffering in multiple ways: the finder's fees, the investment returns, and probably a bonus structure based on occupancy rates." The revelation hit the room like a bombshell. Roberto sank back into his chair, his face ashen. Carmen was staring at her brother with an expression of dawning horror. "But the most disgusting part," Grandpa said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more impact than if he'd been shouting, "was watching you use my supposed mental decline to justify keeping Rachel away from me. You turned my desire to see my granddaughter into evidence of confusion. You made my complaints about mistreatment into symptoms of paranoia. You weaponized your lies about my mental state to silence the one person who was trying to help me." He leaned back in his chair, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm but implacable. "So let me explain my decisions about this. Will, Roberto, Carmen, Diego, Sofia, you have all shown me exactly who you are. You are people who will exploit the vulnerable for profit. You are people who will lie to protect your own interests. You are people who will sacrifice family relationships to avoid accountability for your actions." The room was completely silent except for the soft sounds of Sophia's crying. "Rachel, on the other hand, has shown me exactly who she is. She is someone who will risk family relationships to protect someone she loves. She is someone who will ask hard questions even when it makes her unpopular. She is someone who sees elderly people as human beings deserving of dignity and respect, not as profit centers to be exploited." Grandpa looked directly into the camera, and I felt like he was looking straight at me. "Rachel, sweetheart, I know you're probably feeling guilty about this inheritance. I know you're probably thinking that you should share it with the others, that family should stick together despite everything that's happened. But I want you to understand something very important." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This isn't their inheritance that I'm giving to you. This is my money, earned through my work, managed through my investments, saved through my careful planning. They were never entitled to it. They assumed they would inherit it. But entitlement and reality are two very different things." His voice grew stronger, more determined. "I am giving my money to the person who earned it through love, loyalty, and genuine care for my well-being. I am giving it to the person who was willing to be hated by her own family rather than allow her grandfather to suffer in silence. I am giving it to the person who has the character and judgment to use it well." The video was winding down, but I could see there was more Grandpa wanted to say. "And to Roberto, Carmen, Diego, and Sofia, I want you to understand that your actions have consequences. You exploited an elderly man for profit. You lied about his mental state to silence criticism. You separated him from the person who loved him most. Those choices have cost you far more than money. His expression softened slightly, showing a glimpse of the grandfather I remembered. I hope someday you'll understand what you've lost. Not just the inheritance, but the respect of a man who loved you, who trusted you, who believed you were better than your worst impulses. I hope you'll learn from this experience and become the people I once thought you were. The screen went dark, leaving us all sitting in stunned silence. The weight of Grandpa's words, the depth of his disappointment, the finality of his judgment, it all hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned everything familiar to the ground. But as I sat there, tears still streaming down my face, I felt something else too. For the first time in 8 months, I felt vindicated. For the first time since Grandpa's death, I felt his love surrounding me again, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope for the future. The silence that followed Grandpa Ted's video was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of profound stillness that follows an earthquake, when the world has shifted so fundamentally that everyone is afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to acknowledge what just happened. Mr. Henderson was the first to break the spell. He reached across the table and gently closed the laptop, the soft click of the lid seeming unnaturally loud in the devastated conference room. When he looked up, his kind eyes swept across each of our faces, taking in the wreckage of a family that had just been torn apart by truth. I believe that concludes the primary will reading, he said quietly. However, there are several additional documents that your grandfather left in my care. Rachel, these are specifically for you. He pulled out a manila envelope marked with my name in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I reached for it, still trying to process everything I'd just heard. 8 months of guilt and self-doubt had been swept away in the span of 30 minutes, replaced by a grief so pure and overwhelming that I could barely function. Before you open that, Mr. Henderson continued, I should inform everyone that Mr. Martinez also left very specific instructions regarding what should happen next. He anticipated that there might be resistance to his final wishes. Roberto finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. We'll contest this. Mental incompetence, undue influence, fraud. No court will uphold a will based on the paranoid fantasies of a sick old man. Mr. Henderson's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Mr. Martinez anticipated that response as well, which is why he took additional precautions. He opened his briefcase and pulled out what looked like a legal contract bound in blue backing. 6 weeks before his death, your father executed something called a no-contest clause. Are you familiar with that legal concept, Mr. Martinez? Roberto's face went even paler. As someone who owned multiple businesses, he clearly knew exactly what a no-contest clause meant. For those who aren't familiar, Mr. Henderson continued, addressing the rest of us, a no-contest clause stipulates that anyone who challenges the will automatically forfeits any request they might have received. In this case, it means that if any of you contest this will, you forfeit even the symbolic items your father left you. Carmen looked confused. But we didn't get anything valuable anyway. Just those documents and reports. Actually, Mr. Henderson interrupted, those documents are extremely valuable. They represent the only evidence that stands between you and potential criminal prosecution. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Diego shot forward in his chair. What do you mean, criminal prosecution? Mr. Henderson consulted his notes. Your grandfather's investigation uncovered evidence of several potentially criminal activities: elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy to defraud elderly residents of care facilities, violation of state healthcare regulations. The list goes on. He pulled out another folder, this one marked with an official-looking seal. These are copies of reports that have already been filed with the Oregon Department of Human Services, the State Attorney General's Office, and the FBI's Elder Fraud Unit. The color drained from Roberto's face. You can't do this. There's no proof of criminal activity. Business relationships aren't illegal. Business relationships that involve systematic abuse of elderly residents while concealing safety violations and taking kickbacks might be, Mr. Henderson said calmly. That determination, of course, will be up to law enforcement and the courts. Sophia was hyperventilating now. We didn't know about any of this. Grandpa never told us. Your grandfather tried to tell you, I said, speaking for the first time since the video ended. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow and distant. He tried to tell all of you, but you decided he was crazy instead of listening to him. Rachel's right, Mr. Henderson said. The documentation shows that Mr. Martinez raised concerns about his care multiple times with various family members. Each time, those concerns were dismissed as confusion or mental decline. He opened yet another folder. However, your grandfather was a fair man. He understood that some family members might have been genuinely unaware of the extent of the problems, which is why he provided a way for charges to be dropped. Carmen leaned forward desperately. What way? What do we have to do? You have to accept the will as written, without contest or challenge. You have to sign affidavits acknowledging that your grandfather was of sound mind when he made these decisions. And you have to cooperate fully with any investigations into Sunset Manor and Golden Years Healthcare Group. Roberto stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is blackmail. Pure and simple. You can't threaten us with criminal prosecution to force us to accept an invalid will. I'm not threatening you with anything. Mr. Henderson replied evenly. I'm simply informing you of reports that have already been filed based on evidence your father collected. Whether those reports result in criminal charges depends entirely on what the authorities find when they investigate. He paused, letting that sink in. Your father's offer to keep certain evidence confidential was contingent on the family accepting his final wishes without challenge. If you choose to contest the will, that offer is void, and all evidence goes to the appropriate authorities immediately. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Grandpa had given them a choice: accept his judgment of their character and actions, or face the full consequences of what they'd done. Either way, justice would be served. How long do we have to decide? Diego asked, his voice barely audible. The no contest clause goes into effect immediately, Mr. Henderson said. The moment anyone files a challenge to this will, they forfeit any protection the confidentiality agreement might have provided. Carmen was crying again, but these weren't the theatrical sobs she'd displayed earlier. These were the quiet tears of someone who finally understood the magnitude of what she'd lost. How could Dad do this to us? We're his children. He didn't do this to you, I said, my voice gaining strength. You did this to yourselves. Every choice you made, every lie you told, every time you dismissed his concerns, you did this. I stood up, the manila envelope still clutched in my hands. For the first time in 8 months, I felt like I could look my family in the eye without shame or apology. Grandpa didn't punish you for being imperfect. I continued. He punished you for being cruel, for putting profit over people, for treating him like a burden instead of a human being, for lying about his mental state to cover up your own failures. Roberto turned on me with desperate fury. You self-righteous little, this is all your fault. If you hadn't started stirring up trouble, none of this would have happened. You're right, I said calmly. If I hadn't started asking questions about Grandpa's care, you could have continued exploiting him and other elderly residents indefinitely. If I hadn't spoken up about the problems at Sunset Manor, you could have kept collecting your kickbacks while people suffered. If I hadn't loved my grandfather enough to risk your anger, you could have maintained your comfortable lies. I looked around the room at the faces of people I'd once called family. But I did ask questions. I did speak up. I did love him enough to risk everything. And that's exactly why he left me everything. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. Rachel, your grandfather also left some additional items for you. They're in the safe downstairs. Would you like me to retrieve them while you review the documents in that envelope? I nodded, not trusting my voice anymore. As Mr. Henderson left the room, I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were several items: a letter in Grandpa's handwriting, a small key, a photograph I'd never seen before, and what looked like a deed to property I didn't recognize. The letter was thick, several pages written in Grandpa's careful script. I unfolded it carefully, aware that my family was watching my every move, probably hoping for some sign that this was all a mistake, that there was some loophole that would save them. "My dearest Rachel," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've just learned some very difficult truths about our family. I know you're probably feeling overwhelmed, guilty, and confused. You probably think you don't deserve this inheritance, that you should share it with the others, despite everything that's happened. I know this because I know your heart, and I know that your first instinct is always to heal rather than to harm." I had to stop reading for a moment, overcome by the accuracy of his words. He did know me, better than I sometimes knew myself. "But I need you to understand something very important," the letter continued. "This inheritance isn't just about money or property, it's about trust, responsibility, and the continuation of values that I fear have been lost in the rest of our family." The next paragraph made me gasp out loud. "The key in this envelope opens a safety deposit box at Pacific Northwest Bank, not First National. Inside that box, you'll find additional documents that I chose not to share with the others today. Evidence of other business dealings, other victims, other schemes that Roberto and his associates have perpetrated over the years. This evidence is your insurance policy, your protection against any retaliation they might attempt." My hands were shaking so hard I could barely continue reading. There was more evidence, more victims. How deep did this corruption go? "I also need to tell you about the property deed," Grandpa's letter continued. 3 years ago, when I first became concerned about Roberto's business practices, I purchased a small farm outside of Salem under a trust name. It's 15 acres of good land with a modest house, completely paid for and in your name. Now, if you ever feel unsafe or need to disappear for a while, you have a place to go where no one can find you. A safe house. Grandpa had been so concerned about potential retaliation that he'd secretly bought me a safe house. The depth of his planning, his foresight, his care for my well-being even from beyond the grave, it was almost overwhelming. "But most importantly," the letter went on, "I need you to know that I'm not giving you this inheritance as a burden. I'm giving it to you as a gift, as a tool to help you accomplish all the good things I know you'll do with it. Start that nonprofit you talked about, help other elderly people who are being exploited. Use this money to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to others." The final paragraph was the hardest to read. "I love you, sweetheart. I'm proud of the woman you've become, proud of your courage, proud of your integrity, proud of your willingness to do what's right even when it costs you everything. You are the best of our family, and I trust you to carry on the values that matter most." It was signed simply, "All my love, Grandpa Ted." "P.S. The photograph is from your college graduation. You probably don't remember, but I was so proud of you that day that I cried during your speech. I wanted you to have a picture of the moment when I realized you'd grown into exactly the person I'd hoped you'd become." I looked at the photograph through blurry eyes. It showed me at the podium during my valedictorian speech, but the camera had captured Grandpa in the audience, tears streaming down his face, his expression radiating pure love and pride. I didn't remember seeing him cry that day, but he'd been there, documenting the moment for a future I couldn't have imagined. Mr. Henderson returned with a small wooden box and several additional folders. "These are the items from the safe," he said, setting them on the table in front of me. "And these are some additional legal documents you'll need to review." Roberto was staring at the box like it might contain a bomb. "What else is there? How many more secrets did he keep?" Mr. Henderson opened the box carefully. Inside were Grandpa's war medals from Vietnam, his wedding ring, a pocket watch that had belonged to his father, and a small velvet jewelry case. But underneath these personal items was something that made Roberto go completely white: a small recording device. "Your grandfather was very thorough in his documentation," Mr. Henderson said quietly. This device contains recordings of conversations with various family members over the past year. Conversations in which certain admissions were made about business practices, about his care at Sunset Manor, about the financial arrangements with the facility. Carmen's voice was barely a whisper. He was recording us. Only after it became clear that his concerns were being dismissed and his mental state was being questioned, Mr. Henderson clarified. He felt he needed to protect himself against accusations of confusion or false memories. The recordings would be devastating. I could only imagine what my family had said in private conversations with Grandpa, what admissions they'd made, what casual cruelties they'd revealed when they thought he was too confused to remember or understand. "This is everything, isn't it?" Sophia asked desperately. "Please tell me this is everything." Mr. Henderson consulted his notes one final time. "There is one more item. Mr. Martinez established a scholarship fund at Portland State University for students studying social work or elder advocacy. The fund is endowed with $500,000 and will provide full tuition assistance for 2 students per year in perpetuity." He looked directly at me. "The fund is named the Rachel Martinez Memorial Scholarship for Social Justice." I started crying again, overwhelmed by the depth of Grandpa's love and faith in me. Even in death, he was supporting my dreams, ensuring that other young people could pursue the kind of work that mattered to both of us. "Memorial Scholarship?" Diego asked. "But Rachel isn't dead." "Your grandfather felt that the Rachel who had been part of this family was effectively dead," Mr. Henderson explained, "killed by the lies and manipulations of the past 8 months. The scholarship honors the memory of that relationship while supporting the future of the woman she's become." It was a final, devastating judgment on what my family had done. In their efforts to silence me and protect their own interests, they had killed something precious and irreplaceable. The granddaughter who had once loved them unconditionally, who had believed the best of them despite evidence to the contrary, who had desperately wanted to remain part of the family, despite their cruelty. That person was gone forever. What remained was someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more careful about who deserved her trust and love. As I gathered up the documents, the recordings, the keys, and the photograph, I looked one last time at the people I'd once called family. They sat in their expensive clothes, in their expensive lawyer's office, surrounded by the wreckage of their own making, finally understanding the true cost of their choices. "Rachel," Carmen said desperately, "surely we can work something out. We're still family. We can fix this." I stood up, cradling Grandpa's final gifts against my chest. "No," I said quietly, "we can't fix this, and we're not family anymore. Family protects each other. Family tells the truth. Family doesn't sacrifice love for profit." I walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. "But I want you to know something. If you had listened to me 8 months ago, if you had taken my concerns seriously instead of branding me a troublemaker, we might have been able to fix Sunset Manor. We might have been able to ensure that Grandpa got proper care. We might have been able to preserve some semblance of our relationships." The truth of that statement hung in the air between us. Instead, you chose to silence me, to lie about him, and to prioritize your financial interests over his well-being. Those choices have consequences. Today, you're learning what those consequences are. As I reached for the door handle, Roberto made one last desperate attempt. "You can't leave us with nothing, Rachel. We're your family. Your grandfather raised us too." I turned back to face him, and when I spoke, my voice carried some of the steel resolve I'd heard in Grandpa's video. "You're not left with nothing, Uncle Roberto. You're left with exactly what you earned. The difference is that for the first time in your lives, someone was keeping score." And with that, I walked out of the conference room, out of the law office, and out of their lives forever, carrying with me the weight of Grandpa's love and the promise of a future built on truth instead of lies. The autumn air hit my face like a slap as I stepped out of Henderson and Associates, but for the first time in 8 months, I welcomed the sting. Everything felt different now. The colors seemed sharper, the sounds clearer. Even my own breathing felt more deliberate. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, clutching Grandpa's final gifts, watching the normal world go about its business while my entire universe had just been rebuilt from the ground up. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a split second, my heart clenched, expecting another barrage of threats or manipulation from my family. Instead, I saw a number I didn't recognize, Ms. Martinez. This is Detective Sarah Chen with the Oregon State Police Elder Abuse Unit. Could we meet to discuss your grandfather's case? I believe you'll want to hear what we've discovered. The text included an address for a coffee shop just 3 blocks away and a request to meet in an hour. I typed back a quick confirmation, then started walking, needing the movement to process everything that had happened. As I walked, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Mrs. Patterson from the community center, and I answered immediately. "Rachel, honey, how are you holding up?" Her warm voice was exactly what I needed to hear. "I've been worried sick since you left for that lawyer meeting." I paused, trying to find words that could possibly encompass what I'd just experienced. "It's complicated, Mrs. Patterson. Really complicated. But I think it's going to be okay." "Well, you sound different," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Stronger somehow. Are you coming back to work today? Because we have a situation here that I think you're going to want to know about." I checked my watch. "I have a meeting with a police detective first, but I can be there afterward." "What kind of situation?" "The kind that involves your grandfather and some other residents from that fancy assisted living place. Families have been calling all morning, asking questions about their loved one's care." "Word is getting around, Rachel. People are starting to ask the same questions you were asking 8 months ago." My heart started beating faster. "How many families?" "7 so far. And it's not even noon yet. I think your grandfather's investigation is about to become a lot bigger than just your family." After hanging up, I continued walking toward the coffee shop. My mind racing. Grandpa hadn't just been documenting his own mistreatment, he'd been building a case that could help dozens of other elderly residents and their families. The scope of his planning was becoming clearer with each passing hour. The coffee shop was a small, intimate place called the Daily Grind, tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing shop. I spotted Detective Chen immediately, a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She was sitting at a corner table with a laptop and several folders spread out in front of her. "Miss Martinez." She stood up as I approached, extending her hand. "Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice. I'm Sarah Chen." As we settled into our seats, Detective Chen opened one of her folders. "I'll be direct with you, Rachel. Your grandfather's case has opened up what we believe to be a significant elder abuse operation. We've been investigating complaints about Sunset Manor for over a year, but we never had the kind of comprehensive documentation your grandfather provided." She pulled out a photograph of a man I didn't recognize, middle-aged, well-dressed, with cold eyes and a practiced smile. "This is Marcus Webb, the owner of Golden Years Healthcare Group. He owns 6 facilities across Oregon and Washington, and we're finding similar patterns of abuse and neglect at all of them." My stomach dropped. 6 facilities? How many residents are we talking about? Over 400 elderly people across all the facilities. Your grandfather's documentation has given us the evidence we need to pursue criminal charges, but we need more. We need families to come forward, to share their experiences, to help us build cases that will stick in court. Detective Chen leaned forward, her expression intense. "Your grandfather mentioned in his files that you work with families in crisis at the community center. He thought you might be willing to help us reach out to other families who might be affected." The magnitude of what she was asking hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about my family anymore. This was about hundreds of vulnerable elderly people who might be suffering the same neglect and abuse that Grandpa had endured. "What would that involve?" I asked. "We'd like you to work with us as a victim advocate," she explained. "Help families understand their rights, walk them through the process of documenting abuse, provide support during interviews and depositions. Your grandfather spoke very highly of your education in social work and your experience with crisis intervention." I thought about Grandpa's letter, about his instructions to use the inheritance to help other elderly people facing exploitation. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was exactly what he'd wanted me to do. "I'll do it," I said without hesitation. "When do we start?" Detective Chen smiled for the first time since I'd met her. "Actually, we've already started. We've been getting calls all morning from families who heard rumors about your grandfather's case. Word travels fast in the eldercare community." She handed me a business card and a thick packet of information. "This contains guidelines for victim advocacy, legal procedures, and contact information for our entire task force. We've also set up a hotline for families to report concerns." As I flipped through the packet, one particular document caught my attention. It was a press release, already drafted and ready for distribution. State police announce major elder abuse investigation following whistleblower evidence. "You're going public with this?" I asked. "We have to. Your grandfather's evidence is solid, but we need more victims to come forward to build the strongest possible case. Public awareness will help families recognize the signs of abuse and give them courage to speak up." The press release mentioned that the investigation had been triggered by comprehensive documentation provided by a concerned family member. It didn't name me specifically, but I knew it wouldn't take long for people to figure out who had blown the whistle. "Detective Chen," I said carefully, "what should I expect in terms of retaliation?" My family made it clear that they're not happy about this situation. Her expression darkened. "Your grandfather was concerned about that too. That's why he provided us with so much documentation. He wanted to make sure you were protected. We've already flagged your case for monitoring, and we have evidence of potential witness intimidation if anyone tries to pressure you to drop the investigation." She pulled out another folder. "We've also been investigating the financial side of this operation. Your Uncle Roberto's involvement goes much deeper than just kickbacks and investment returns. He's been actively recruiting families to move their elderly relatives to these substandard facilities, and he's been coached on how to dismiss complaints as normal aging issues or confusion." The folder contained bank records, email chains, and what looked like training materials. I could see Roberto's name on several documents, along with other names I didn't recognize. There's a whole network of people involved in this scheme. Detective Chen continued. Doctors who rubber stamp facility recommendations, social workers who discourage families from asking questions, even judges who fast-track guardianship cases to move elderly people into these facilities against their will. The scope of the corruption was staggering. This wasn't just about one bad facility or one greedy businessman, it was a systematic exploitation of vulnerable elderly people, orchestrated by people in positions of trust. "Your grandfather stumbled onto something much bigger than he initially realized," Detective Chen said. "His investigation helped us connect dots that we'd been trying to connect for years." My phone buzzed with another text, this one from a number I recognized. "Sophia, my cousin, was trying to reach me. Rachel, please call me. We need to talk. This is getting out of hand." I showed the message to Detective Chen, who frowned. "Any contact from your family should be documented. They're all potential witnesses in this case, and any attempts to influence your testimony could be considered obstruction of justice." "Should I respond?" I asked. "Not directly, but if you're comfortable with it, we'd like to monitor any communications they attempt. Your grandfather suspected they might try to pressure you once the investigation became public." She handed me a small device that looked like a phone charger. "This is a recording device. If any family members try to meet with you or pressure you to change your story, we'd like you to document those conversations." The reality of my situation was beginning to sink in. I wasn't just the beneficiary of Grandpa's will. I was the key witness in a major criminal investigation. My family wouldn't just be angry about losing their inheritance, they'd be desperate to prevent me from testifying against them. "Detective Chen," I said, "my grandfather left me a property outside of Salem. He said it was somewhere I could go if I felt unsafe. Should I be considering that option? It might not be a bad idea, at least until the initial arrests are made. We're planning to execute search warrants on the facilities and several associated businesses within the next 48 hours. Once that happens, Everyone involved will know that this investigation is serious and comprehensive. She closed her laptop and gathered her folders. Rachel, I want you to know that what you're doing takes real courage. Your grandfather was right to trust you with this responsibility. You're not just seeking justice for him, you're potentially saving hundreds of other elderly people from the same kind of abuse. As we prepared to leave, Detective Chen handed me one more document. This is a victim impact statement form. If and when this case goes to trial, you'll have the opportunity to tell the court how your grandfather's treatment affected him and your family. It's not required, but many victims find it healing to have their voices heard. I stared at the form, thinking about all the things I wanted to say about Grandpa's final months, about the pain of being separated from him, about the guilt I'd carried for months thinking I'd failed him. Maybe someday I'd be ready to put all of that into words for a judge and jury. There's one more thing, Detective Chen said as we walked toward the door. Your grandfather left specific instructions that if anything happened to him, you should receive this. She handed me a small envelope marked for Rachel, open only after my death. Inside was a key and a brief note. Storage Unit 247 at Salem Self-Storage. Everything you need to continue the fight. Another piece of Grandpa's elaborate planning. Another secret cache of evidence and resources. I was beginning to understand that he'd spent his final months not just documenting the abuse he was suffering, but building a comprehensive case that could survive his death and continue protecting others. As I walked back toward my car, my phone rang again. This time, it was Mrs. Patterson. Rachel, you need to get down here right away, she said, her voice excited. Channel 8 News just showed up asking about elder abuse investigations, and 3 more families have called about their relatives at assisted living facilities. I think your grandfather's story is about to become a lot bigger than any of us imagined. I could hear voices in the background, the busy sounds of a community center suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Are they asking for me specifically? Not yet, but they're asking about the community center's role in helping families navigate elder care issues. I think they've figured out that this investigation started with someone connected to our advocacy work. As I drove toward the community center, my mind was reeling. In the span of a few hours, I'd gone from being the disinherited granddaughter to the wealthy heiress to the key witness in a major criminal investigation. But more than that, I was becoming exactly what Grandpa had always believed I could be, someone who fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. The inheritance wasn't just money and property, it was responsibility, purpose, and the resources to make a real difference in the world. Grandpa had given me the tools, now it was up to me to use them wisely. As I pulled into the community center parking lot, I could see the news van and several cars I didn't recognize. Families were arriving, clutching folders of documents, looking for answers about their loved one's care. The investigation that had started with my concerns about Grandpa's treatment was about to become a movement. I sat in my car for a moment, taking deep breaths and preparing myself for what came next. This was my chance to honor Grandpa's memory, to validate his faith in me, and to ensure that his suffering hadn't been in vain. The scared, guilty young woman who had walked into the law office that morning was gone. In her place was someone with purpose, resources, and the backing of law enforcement to make real change happen. It was time to continue the fight that Grandpa had started, using every tool he'd given me to protect the vulnerable and expose those who would exploit them. The war against elder abuse was just beginning, and I was ready to lead it. The community center looked like the eye of a hurricane when I arrived. News vans from 3 different stations lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray October sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Families clutched manila folders and worn purses as they hurried through the front doors, their faces showing the same mixture of hope and desperation I remembered feeling just hours earlier. Mrs. Patterson met me at the entrance, her usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled excitement. Rachel, thank God you're here. It's been absolute chaos since word got out about the investigation. We've had 17 families call in the last 2 hours, and that reporter from Channel 8 has been asking very specific questions about your grandfather's case. She guided me through the lobby, past clusters of elderly people and their adult children huddled in intense conversations. I recognized some faces from previous community events, but many were strangers who'd driven from as far away as Eugene and Salem after hearing rumors about the investigation. "Mrs. Patterson," I said quietly, "I need to tell you something important. This investigation is much bigger than anyone realized, and I'm going to be working directly with the police as a victim advocate. Things are about to get very intense around here." Her eyes widened, but she nodded grimly. I figured as much when Detective Chen called asking if we could host an information session here tonight. She said families need a safe place to come forward with their stories. We'd reached her office and she closed the door behind us before continuing. "Rachel, I need you to know that there are already rumors circulating about your family's involvement in this. Some people are saying Roberto Martinez has been steering families toward specific facilities for years." My stomach clenched. The news was spreading faster than I'd anticipated. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that Roberto called here an hour ago demanding to speak with you. He was agitated. Said some very unpleasant things about family loyalty and consequences." She handed me a slip of paper with a phone message. Roberto's words, transcribed in Mrs. Patterson's neat handwriting, sent a chill down my spine. "Tell Rachel that family business should stay family business. Some things are better left buried with the dead. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to save that message and any others that come in. The police need to document any attempts at intimidation." Before she could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door. "Mrs. Patterson? This is Linda Walsh from Channel 8 News. Could I speak with you about the elder abuse investigation?" Mrs. Patterson looked at me questioningly. I thought about Detective Chen's advice about public awareness helping families come forward. "Let me handle this," I said. I opened the door to find a professionally dressed woman in her 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She was accompanied by a cameraman who kept his equipment lowered in a gesture of respect. "Ms. Walsh, I'm Rachel Martinez. I understand you're looking for information about the elder abuse investigation." Her eyes lit up with recognition. "Ms. Martinez, yes, we've been hearing that a family member's advocacy work led to this investigation. Would you be willing to go on record about what you've discovered?" I thought about Grandpa's wish to protect other elderly people, about the families gathering in the lobby, about the 400 residents across 6 facilities who might be suffering in silence. "I'll talk to you, but not about my family specifically. I want to talk about the broader issue of elder abuse and how families can protect their loved ones." The interview took place in the community center's main meeting room. As the cameraman set up his equipment, more families continued to arrive. I could see them through the glass doors, clutching documentation, some crying, others looking determined and angry. "We're live in 5, the cameraman announced. Linda Walsh smoothed her jacket and looked directly into the camera. "This is Linda Walsh reporting from the Eastside Community Center in Portland, where families are gathering tonight following news of a major elder abuse investigation. With me is Rachel Martinez, a social worker who has been working with families to identify signs of neglect and abuse in assisted living facilities." She turned to me. "Rachel, can you tell us what signs families should look for if they suspect their loved one is being mistreated?" I took a deep breath, thinking about everything I'd learned over the past months. The most important thing is to trust your instincts. If your loved one seems afraid of staff members, if they've lost significant weight, if they have unexplained injuries or seem overly sedated, those are red flags. But the biggest warning sign is when facilities try to limit your access to your family member or dismiss your concerns as normal aging issues. What should families do if they suspect abuse? Document everything. Take photos, keep detailed notes, request copies of all medical records. Contact the state elder abuse hotline and don't let anyone convince you that you're overreacting. Your loved one's safety is more important than being polite or avoiding conflict. Linda leaned forward. "We're hearing that this investigation involves multiple facilities and potentially hundreds of residents. How widespread is elder abuse in Oregon?" "It's more common than most people realize, and it often involves financial exploitation as well as physical neglect. Some facilities are run by people who see elderly residents as profit centers rather than human beings deserving of dignity and care. As we finished the interview, I noticed Detective Chen had arrived and was speaking with several families in the lobby. She caught my eye and gestured toward a group of people who looked particularly distressed. "Thank you, Rachel," Linda Walsh said, as the cameraman powered down his equipment. "This story is going to help a lot of families." I made my way to where Detective Chen was standing with 3 families. Their stories were heartbreakingly familiar: unexplained injuries, medication errors, weight loss, and facility staff who became defensive when questioned about care standards. "My mother was at Sunset Manor for 6 months," said Janet Morrison, a woman about my age whose hands shook as she spoke. "She went in walking and talking, and by the time we moved her out, she could barely feed herself. The staff kept saying it was a natural progression of her condition, but she improved dramatically once we got her proper care elsewhere." An elderly man named Frank Chen, no relation to the detective, had brought a folder thick with documentation. "My wife Helen was given the wrong medication for 3 weeks at Golden Valley Assisted Living. When I complained, they said I was being disruptive and threatened to ban me from visiting. Helen nearly died from the medication interaction." The third family, the Johnsons, had the most disturbing story. Their father had died at Sunshine Gardens, another Golden Years facility, after falling in the bathroom during the night shift, when only one aide was on duty for 40 residents. "They said it was an accident, that these things happen with elderly people," Mrs. Johnson said through tears. "But we found out later that they'd been cited multiple times for understaffing and that 3 other residents had died in similar circumstances." Detective Chen was taking detailed notes, but I could see the pattern that was emerging. Each facility had the same problems: understaffing, medication errors, defensive management, and a systematic pattern of dismissing family concerns. "How many facilities are we talking about?" I asked Detective Chen quietly. 6 confirmed, but we're getting reports about others." The parent company, Golden Years Healthcare Group, has been expanding rapidly across the Pacific Northwest. "We think this could involve facilities in Washington and California as well." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop talking to reporters or you'll regret it. Some secrets should stay buried." A friend. I showed the message to Detective Chen, who immediately called for backup. "This kind of intimidation tells us we're on the right track," she said. "Someone is getting very nervous about what you might reveal." As the evening progressed, more families arrived with their stories. The community center had transformed into an impromptu crisis center, with families sharing information, comparing experiences, and finding strength in numbers. Mrs. Tatterson had set up several conference rooms where people could speak privately with Detective Chen and her team. Around 8 p.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed my Aunt Carmen's number. "Rachel, please, you have to stop this." Carmen's voice was desperate, barely controlled. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to our family? Roberto's business is being destroyed. The news is calling him an elder abuse enabler. Sophia's real estate license is being investigated. Diego's clinics are being audited." "Good," I said simply. "Maybe now they'll understand what it feels like to have their credibility questioned and their livelihoods threatened." "This isn't just about us anymore," Carmen continued. "The police came to Roberto's office today with a search warrant. They seized all his files, his computers, his client lists. They're treating him like a criminal." "If Roberto committed crimes, then he should be treated like a criminal," I replied. "Grandpa tried to tell you there were problems, but you chose to silence him instead of listening. Your grandfather was sick. Rachel, you turned him against his own family. You poisoned his mind with paranoid fantasies about conspiracies and cover-up." The old guilt tried to surface, the familiar voice telling me that maybe I really was the problem, that maybe I'd caused all this pain and destruction. But then I thought about the families I'd met tonight, about the documentation Detective Chen had shown me, about the systematic abuse that had been happening long before I'd ever raised a concern. "Carmen," I said quietly, "I'm going to hang up now. If you want to communicate with me further, you can do it through my attorney. And just so you know, This conversation is being recorded. I could hear her gasp before I ended the call. Detective Chen had been listening and nodded approvingly. Your family is panicking, she observed. That usually means they know they're guilty of something significant. Around 9 p.m., the local news aired the story about the elder abuse investigation. I watched from Mrs. Patterson's office as Linda Walsh reported on the whistleblower who exposed widespread abuse in Oregon assisted living facilities. They didn't use my name, but they showed footage of families gathering at the community center and mentioned that more victims were encouraged to come forward. My phone immediately exploded with messages. Some were supportive, from colleagues and friends who recognized my voice from the interview. Others were threatening, from people I didn't know who seemed to have connections to the facilities under investigation. The most disturbing message came from Marcus Webb himself, the owner of Golden Years Healthcare Group. Ms. Martinez, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about your grandfather's care. I'd like to meet with you privately to discuss a settlement that would be beneficial to everyone involved. Some matters are better resolved quietly without the need for public scrutiny that might embarrass all parties concerned. Detective Chen read the message and immediately got on her radio. This is exactly the kind of witness tampering we were expecting. Webb is trying to buy your silence before you can testify. She looked at me seriously. Rachel, I think it's time to consider relocating to that safe house your grandfather arranged. These people are getting desperate, and desperate people make dangerous decisions. As if to emphasize her point, Mrs. Patterson came rushing into the office. Rachel, there are 3 men outside asking questions about you. They're not reporters, and they're not police. They're making some of the families very nervous. Through the window, I could see 3 large men in dark suits standing near the news vans, taking photos of license plates and talking on cell phones. They had the look of private security or hired intimidation specialists. That's it, Detective Chen said. We're getting you out of here now. Mrs. Patterson, is there a back exit? As we gathered my things and prepared to leave through the community center's rear entrance, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed in the course of a single day. This morning I'd been a disgraced granddaughter living in shame and isolation. Tonight I was a protected witness in a major criminal investigation, with law enforcement escort and a safe house waiting for me. But more than that, I was finally doing what Grandpa had always believed I could do, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, using my voice to expose injustice and protect the vulnerable. The inheritance he'd left me wasn't just money and property. It was purpose, responsibility, and the tools to make a real difference in the world. As Detective Chen's unmarked car pulled away from the community center, I looked back to see families still arriving, still seeking answers, still hoping for justice for their loved ones. The investigation that had started with my concerns about Grandpa's care was becoming a movement, and I was proud to be at the center of it. The real work was just beginning. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Grandpa's final gift wasn't just vindication, it was transformation, turning his granddaughter from victim to advocate, from outcast to leader in the fight for elder justice. 6 months later, I stood in the hallway of the federal courthouse in Portland, watching through the glass doors as Roberto Martinez was led away in handcuffs. The orange jumpsuit was a stark contrast to the expensive suits he'd worn during the trial, and the reporters shouting questions created a chaos that would have terrified me a year ago. Now, I felt only a deep sense of satisfaction and closure. The verdict had come down just an hour earlier, guilty on all counts. Wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, racketeering, and criminal enterprise. Roberto would spend the next 15 years in federal prison, and his co-conspirators wouldn't fare much better. Marcus Webb had received 22 years, while several facility administrators and complicit doctors received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. Detective Chen approached me with a tired but triumphant smile. How are you feeling, Rachel? Like Grandpa can finally rest in peace, I said, touching the locket around my neck that contained his photograph. He would have loved seeing justice served like this. The trial had been grueling but necessary. Over the course of 3 months, We'd presented evidence of systematic abuse affecting over 600 elderly residents across 8 facilities in 3 states. The private investigators' documentation, combined with Grandpa's meticulous records and the testimony of dozens of families, had built an unassailable case. My own testimony had lasted 2 full days. I'd told the jury about Grandpa's sharp mind and gentle nature, about the decline we'd witnessed at Sunset Manor, about my family's dismissal of legitimate concerns, and about the months of guilt and isolation I'd endured while believing I was the problem. But most importantly, I'd read excerpts from Grandpa's journals, letting his own words condemn the people who had profited from his suffering. The defense had tried everything, claiming Grandpa was mentally incompetent, arguing that I was a disgruntled family member seeking revenge, suggesting that the facility's problems were just unfortunate accidents rather than criminal neglect. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury had seen through their desperate attempts to shift blame. Carmen and Sophia had escaped criminal charges by cooperating with prosecutors and testifying against Roberto. They'd lost their professional licenses and faced civil lawsuits from victim families, but they'd avoided prison time. Diego had plea bargained down to 3 years in exchange for providing evidence about the medical professionals who'd helped cover up the abuse. But the legal victory was only part of the story. The real transformation had happened in the months leading up to the trial, as the movement that started in the community center had grown into a statewide advocacy network. Ms. Martinez? A young woman with a notebook approached nervously. I'm Jessica Santos, from the Oregonian. Could I ask you about your plans now that the trial is over? I'd given dozens of interviews over the past 6 months, but I never tired of talking about the work we were doing. The trial ending doesn't mean our work is finished. If anything, it's just the beginning. I gestured toward the courthouse steps, where families who'd testified in the trial were gathered in small groups, many of them crying with relief and exhaustion. These families deserve more than just seeing the perpetrators punished. They deserve systemic change that prevents this kind of abuse from happening again. Jessica scribbled notes as I continued. The Theodore Martinez Foundation for Elder Justice officially launches next month. We'll be providing legal advocacy for elder abuse victims, funding surprise inspections of care facilities, and training families to recognize warning signs of neglect and abuse. The foundation had been my primary focus since moving into Grandpa's house on Elm Street. The inheritance that had seemed overwhelming 6 months ago now felt like exactly the right tools for the job ahead. We'd already hired 5 full-time staff members, including a former prosecutor who specialized in elder abuse cases and a registered nurse who'd blown the whistle on previous facility violations. What about your family? Jessica asked. There were reports of significant tension during the trial. I paused, thinking about the final confrontation I'd had with Carmen just 3 weeks earlier. She'd appeared at the foundation's offices unannounced, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. Rachel, please, she'd said, tears streaming down her face. Can't we find a way to move past this? We're still family. I'd looked at her across the conference table where I'd been reviewing testimony preparation with our legal team. For a moment I'd seen echoes of the aunt who'd taught me to braid my hair and had taken me shopping for my first job interview. Carmen, I'd said gently, we stopped being family the moment you chose to protect Roberto's profits over Grandpa's well-being. The moment you decided that preserving your lifestyle was more important than an elderly man's dignity and safety. She'd sobbed then, the kind of deep, wrenching cries that come from someone who finally understands the true cost of their choices. I didn't know it was that bad. I thought we were helping him by keeping him somewhere safe. You didn't know because you chose not to know. I'd replied. Every time Grandpa tried to tell you about problems, you dismissed his concerns. Every time I tried to advocate for him, you branded me a troublemaker. You created a system where the truth couldn't reach you because the truth was inconvenient. I'd stood up then, my voice gaining strength. But the worst part wasn't the neglect or the financial exploitation. The worst part was watching you use his supposed mental decline to justify keeping me away from him. You weaponized lies about dementia to silence the one person who was trying to help him. Carmen had left that day without another word, and I hadn't seen her since. Sometimes I felt a pang of sadness for the relationships that had been lost, but mostly I felt relief at being free from people who had shown me exactly who they were when tested. My family made their choices, I told Jessica Santos now. They chose profit over people, comfort over conscience. Those choices had consequences, and I'm not responsible for protecting them from those consequences. As the reporter walked away, Mrs. Patterson approached Dr. Patricia Reeves, the psychiatrist who'd evaluated Grandpa's mental competency. Dr. Reeves had become an unexpected ally in our advocacy work, using her expertise to help families distinguish between normal aging and signs of abuse or neglect. "Rachel," Dr. Reeves said, "I wanted you to know that your grandfather would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. He talked about you constantly during our sessions. Your dedication to social justice, your compassion for vulnerable people, your unwillingness to accept injustice even when it cost you personally." Mrs. Patterson nodded enthusiastically. "The community center has received over $200,000 in donations since the trial started. People want to support the kind of advocacy work that led to this investigation. We're expanding our elder services program and hiring 2 more social workers." The ripple effects of the case had been extraordinary. The state legislature had passed new laws requiring surprise inspections of care facilities, mandating staff-to-resident ratios, and creating a database where families could report concerns anonymously. 3 other states were considering similar legislation. But the most meaningful change was happening at the individual level. Families across the region were asking harder questions about their loved ones' care, demanding accountability from facility administrators, and refusing to accept dismissive responses to legitimate concerns. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," Dr. Reeves said, gesturing toward an elderly woman who was speaking with Detective Chen near the courthouse entrance. As we approached, I recognized the woman from news coverage, Margaret Thompson, whose husband had died at Golden Valley Assisted Living under suspicious circumstances. Her family's lawsuit had been one of the civil cases that followed the criminal trial. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Reeves said, "this is Rachel Martinez." Margaret Thompson took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong for someone in her 80s. "My dear, I can't thank you enough for what you've done. James died 3 years ago, and I've been carrying the guilt ever since, wondering if I could have done something to save him." Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "The facility told me his death was inevitable, that I was being unrealistic to expect better care. They made me feel like a demanding, difficult old woman who didn't understand medical realities." She squeezed my hands tighter. "But your grandfather's case proved that I was right to be concerned, that James's death could have been prevented if the facility had been properly staffed and managed. You've given me closure I never thought I'd have." Mrs. Thompson's words highlighted something I'd learned throughout this process. The abuse wasn't just physical or financial, it was emotional and psychological, designed to make families doubt their own perceptions and accept substandard care as inevitable. "Mrs. Thompson," I said, "would you be interested in joining our foundation's advisory board? We need voices like yours to help us understand how families experience these situations." Her face lit up with purpose. "I'd be honored. James always said that when you see something wrong, you have an obligation to speak up, even if it makes people uncomfortable." As the afternoon wore on, more people approached with their stories, their gratitude, and their commitment to ensuring this kind of systematic abuse never happened again. Former facility employees shared their experiences of being pressured to cut corners and ignore regulations. Healthcare professionals talked about the culture of silence that had allowed the abuse to flourish. Families spoke about their relief at finally being believed and taken seriously. Detective Chen found me as the crowd was beginning to disperse. "Rachel, I have some news you'll want to hear. The FBI has opened investigations into Golden Years Healthcare Group's operations in 4 additional states. Your grandfather's evidence is helping prosecutors build cases from California to Colorado." The scope of the network they'd uncovered was staggering. Roberto's model of recruiting families, collecting kickbacks, and systematically ignoring abuse complaints had been replicated across dozens of facilities. The financial incentives had been so strong that many healthcare professionals had abandoned their ethical obligations in favor of profit. "There's something else," Detective Chin continued. "Marcus Webb has agreed to testify about other players in the industry in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's naming the names of facility owners, administrators, and government inspectors who were part of the corruption network." The investigation that had started with my concerns about Grandpa's medication errors had become a federal racketeering case that would reshape elder care regulation across the country. It was more than either of us could have imagined when we'd first met in that coffee shop 6 months ago. As I drove home to Grandpa's house that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The scared, isolated young woman who had walked into Henderson and Associates that October afternoon felt like a different person entirely. The inheritance that had seemed like an overwhelming burden had become the foundation for meaningful change. The house on Elm Street felt like home now. I'd kept most of Grandpa's furniture and decorations, but I'd added my own touches: photographs from foundation events, thank you letters from families we'd helped, and a wall dedicated to the 47 elderly residents across multiple states who had received better care because of the reforms our case had triggered. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Reeves. "Just heard that Sunset Manor is being shut down permanently. State investigators found 23 major violations during their surprise inspection yesterday. The residents are being transferred to properly managed facilities." I sat in Grandpa's favorite chair, the one where he'd done his crossword puzzles and watched the news, and felt his presence strongly. The validation he'd given me in his final video message had transformed my life, but the real gift had been his example of refusing to accept injustice, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. The next morning, I had a meeting with potential donors who wanted to expand the foundation's work nationally. In the afternoon, I was scheduled to testify before a congressional subcommittee about federal elder care regulations. In the evening, I had dinner plans with Miss Patterson and her husband, who had become my chosen family in the absence of my biological relatives. But first, I had one more important task. I drove to the cemetery where Grandpa was buried, carrying fresh flowers and a folder containing newspaper clippings about the trial verdict. "We did it, Grandpa," I said, kneeling beside his headstone. "Justice for you, justice for all the others, and real change to protect future victims." I placed the clippings next to the flowers, weighted down with a small stone. "The Theodore Martinez Foundation for Elder Justice is going to carry on your fight. Every elderly person who receives better care, every family that's taken seriously when they raise concerns, every facility that improves its standards because they know someone is watching. That's your legacy." A gentle breeze rustled the papers, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice. "That's my girl. I always knew you had it in you." As I walked back to my car, I thought about the scholarship students who would be graduating from Portland State University's social work program next month. The first recipients of the Rachel Martinez Memorial Scholarship for Social Justice. They would enter the field with training in elder advocacy and a commitment to protecting vulnerable populations. The woman my family had tried to silence had found her voice, and that voice was now amplified through a foundation, a scholarship program, and a network of advocates across the country. The inheritance Grandpa had left me wasn't just money. It was purpose, responsibility, and the tools to ensure that love and justice would always triumph over greed and indifference. 6 months ago, I'd been excluded from a will reading because my family considered me ungrateful and troublesome. Today, I was grateful for that exclusion, because it had led me to discover who I really was and what I was truly capable of achieving. The scared, guilty granddaughter was gone forever. In her place was an advocate, a leader, and a guardian of the values that mattered most to the man who had raised me to believe that standing up for what's right is always worth the cost. 3 weeks after the trial ended, I received an unexpected visitor at the foundation offices. Ama Rodriguez, a young attorney from the Department of Justice, had driven up from Sacramento with a proposal that would change everything. "Ms. Martinez," she said, spreading documents across our conference table, "the Attorney General's office wants to offer you a position as Special Advisor for Elder Justice Reform. We're creating a new federal task force, and your expertise in identifying systematic abuse patterns is exactly what we need." The offer was flattering but overwhelming. Leading a federal initiative would mean relocating to Washington, D.C., leaving behind the community that had supported me through the darkest period of my life, and taking on responsibilities that seemed impossibly vast. "What would this position involve?" I asked, scanning the job description she'd provided. "You'd oversee a team of investigators, prosecutors, and victim advocates working on elder abuse cases nationwide. The position comes with a budget of $50 million annually and the authority to coordinate with state attorneys general on multi-jurisdictional cases." Emma leaned forward, her voice taking on an urgent tone. "Rachel, what you uncovered in Oregon was just the tip of the iceberg. Our preliminary investigations have identified similar networks operating in at least 15 states. We need someone who understands how these schemes work from the inside, someone families trust to tell their stories." I thought about Grandpa's words in his final video, about using inheritance to help people who couldn't help themselves. This federal position would amplify that mission beyond anything I could accomplish through the foundation alone. "I'll need time to consider this," I said, "and I'd want guarantees that the foundation's work would continue even if I take the federal position." "Already arranged," Emma replied, pulling out another document. "The Justice Department would provide ongoing funding for the Theodore Martinez Foundation as a key partner organization. Mrs. Patterson has agreed to serve as interim director, and Dr. Reeves would head up the clinical advisory board." That evening, I called Detective Chin to get her perspective on the federal offer. She'd become more than just a professional colleague over the past months. She was one of my closest friends and someone whose judgment I trusted completely. "Take it," she said without hesitation. "Rachel, you have a gift for this work, and the federal platform would let you help thousands of families instead of hundreds. Your grandfather would want you to think big. But what about the work here in Oregon? The families who are just starting to trust the system again. The work here will continue because you've built something sustainable. But there are Mrs. Thompsons and Grandpa Teds in every state, dealing with the same corruption networks, feeling the same isolation you felt 8 months ago. They need an advocate who understands their pain." The next morning, I visited the storage unit Grandpa had left me, the one Detective Chen had mentioned months ago but which I'd never fully explored. Using the key from his final envelope, I opened Unit 2047 at Salem Self-Storage for the first time. What I found inside took my breath away. The unit was organized like a war room, with filing cabinets full of documentation, wall charts mapping connections between facilities and administrators, and boxes of evidence that went far beyond his own case. One particular file caught my attention: Project Elder Shield. Inside were detailed notes about his vision for a national advocacy network, complete with organizational charts, funding strategies, and legislative priorities. At the bottom of the last page, in his familiar handwriting, was a note dated just 2 weeks before his death: "For Rachel, when she's ready to change the world." Grandpa had been planning this federal expansion long before I'd even understood the scope of the problem. He'd researched similar cases in other states, identified potential allies in law enforcement and healthcare, and even drafted policy recommendations for federal legislation. Another box contained letters, hundreds of them from families across the country who had reached out to Grandpa after hearing about his advocacy efforts. Each letter told a similar story: an elderly loved one experiencing suspicious changes in health or behavior, family concerns dismissed by facility staff, and desperate relatives searching for someone who would listen to their fears. I spent 3 hours in that storage unit, reading letter after letter, understanding for the first time that Grandpa's vision had never been limited to Oregon or even to his own case. He'd seen the national scope of elder abuse and had been building a foundation for the kind of comprehensive response the Justice Department was now offering me. One letter particularly stood out, from a woman named Patricia Williams in Phoenix, Arizona. Her 89-year-old mother had died at a facility owned by a company called Desert Sunset Healthcare, a subsidiary, I realized, of the same parent corporation that owned Golden Years Healthcare Group. "Mr. Martinez," the letter read, "I heard about your investigation on the news, and I had to reach out. My mother, Rose Williams died last month at Desert Sunset Manor, under circumstances that don't make sense. She went into the facility walking and mentally sharp, but within 6 weeks she was bedridden and barely responsive. When I asked questions about her medication changes, the staff became hostile and suggested I was being unrealistic about her condition. Patricia Williams had included medical records, photographs, and detailed notes about her mother's declining condition. The pattern was identical to what we'd found in Oregon: rapid deterioration following medication changes, defensive facility responses to family concerns, and a systematic dismissal of legitimate questions about care quality. At the bottom of Patricia's letter was a handwritten postscript. I keep thinking that if someone had been paying attention, if someone had asked the right questions sooner, my mother might still be alive. Please don't let other families go through what we've experienced. I sat in that storage unit, surrounded by evidence of a nationwide crisis that had been hiding in plain sight for years, and finally understood the true scope of what Grandpa had been asking me to take on. This wasn't just about justice for him or even for the hundreds of residents we'd helped in Oregon. This was about preventing thousands of future Patricia Williams from losing their mothers to systematic negligence and abuse. 2 days later, I called Emma Rodriguez and accepted the federal position. The decision meant significant changes. Relocating to Washington, D.C., managing a large staff, testifying before Congress regularly, and coordinating with law enforcement agencies across the country. But it also meant the ability to pursue the kind of comprehensive reform that Grandpa had envisioned. My last week in Oregon was bittersweet. The foundation staff threw a farewell party at the community center, attended by dozens of families whose lives had been changed by our advocacy work. Ms. Patterson presented me with a scrapbook containing thank you letters, newspaper clippings, and photographs from our campaigns. "You're not losing a granddaughter," she said, echoing words Grandpa might have used. "You're gaining a federal advocate who will carry Oregon's voice to the highest levels of government." Detective Chen pulled me aside during the party with one final piece of news. "The Sunset Manor investigation led to something interesting," she said. "Remember that nurse, Betty, who used to work security there? She's been keeping detailed records of everything she witnessed over the past 5 years. Betty Rodriguez had contacted Detective Chen the week after the trial ended, requesting a meeting to discuss what she'd observed during her time at the facility. It turned out she'd been documenting suspicious deaths, medication errors, and administrative cover-ups in a personal journal, hoping someday she'd find someone who would listen. She's agreed to testify in the civil cases, and she's provided evidence about similar problems at 3 other facilities in the chain," Detective Chen continued. "Her testimony could help dozens of additional families get justice for their loved ones." The revelation that allies had been watching and documenting the abuse all along reinforced my conviction that change was possible when people found the courage to speak truth to power. Betty's willingness to come forward, months after the initial investigation, showed that our case had given others permission to break their silence. On my final day in Portland, I drove to Grandpa's house one last time. The new owners, a young family with elderly parents, had agreed to maintain the garden where Grandpa had spent so many peaceful hours. They'd also agreed to keep a small plaque by the front door. Theodore Martinez lived here. He believed that standing up for what's right is always worth the cost. I packed the last of my personal belongings, including Grandpa's chess set, his collection of crossword puzzle books, and the framed photograph from my college graduation. These would travel with me to Washington, reminders of the values and the love that had shaped everything I'd become. The flight to D.C. gave me time to review the briefing materials Emma Rodriguez had provided. The scale of the federal investigation was staggering: potential cases in 37 states, estimated damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and evidence of corruption involving facility owners, state inspectors, healthcare providers, and even some family court judges who'd fast-tracked guardianship cases. But the statistics that meant the most were the human ones. Over 12,000 elderly residents who would receive better care because of improved regulations, 47 families who had received financial settlements for substandard treatment, and an unknown number of future victims who would be protected by the systemic changes we were implementing. My first day at the Justice Department felt surreal. The office they'd assigned me overlooked the National Mall, with a view of the Washington Monument that reminded me daily of the historic significance of the work we were doing. My staff included prosecutors who'd handled major white-collar crime cases, investigators with experience in healthcare fraud, and victim advocates who understood the unique challenges facing elderly abuse survivors. During my first staff meeting, I shared Grandpa's vision of elder justice as a fundamental civil rights issue. "We're not just prosecuting individual cases," I told the team. "We're dismantling systems of exploitation that have operated with impunity for decades." The work was demanding but deeply fulfilling. Within my first month, we'd opened investigations in 8 new states, coordinated with local prosecutors on 17 active cases, and helped establish elder advocacy programs in communities that had never had resources for this kind of work. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 6 weeks into my federal role, when I received a call from Patricia Williams, the woman whose letter I'd found in Grandpa's storage unit. "Miss Martinez," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I just wanted to thank you. The FBI agents you sent to Phoenix found evidence that my mother's death was part of a pattern. 3 other residents died under similar circumstances, and the facility owners are being indicted next week." Patricia's voice grew stronger as she continued. "But more than that, you've given me hope that speaking up can make a difference. I'm working with the local prosecutor's office now, helping them understand how these facilities manipulate families and silence complaints." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Grandpa's final gift had been even greater than I'd understood. He hadn't just left me an inheritance. He'd left me a calling, a purpose that would guide the rest of my life. The foundation we'd built in Oregon was expanding to serve families nationwide. The legal precedents we'd established were being applied in courts across the country. And the courage we'd found to speak truth to power was inspiring others to find their own voices. The excluded granddaughter had become a federal advocate, but more importantly, she'd become exactly the person her grandfather had always believed she could be. The legacy of love and justice would continue, protecting vulnerable elderly people and honoring the memory of a man who'd refused to let systematic abuse go unchallenged. 1 year later, I stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee, presenting the annual report on elder abuse prosecutions. The statistics told a story of unprecedented success. 400 no one-heirs, indicted across 19 states, $2.3 billion in restitution paid to victims' families, and new federal standards that had forced the closure of 43 substandard facilities nationwide. But the numbers that mattered most to me were the personal ones. Angela Foster, age 78, whose daughter had contacted our hotline after noticing unexplained bruises during a facility visit. Our investigation had uncovered systematic physical abuse, leading to criminal charges and Angela's transfer to a properly managed care center where she was thriving. Michael Chen, whose 85-year-old father had been over-medicated to the point of near catatonia at a facility in Nevada. Our medical experts had worked with his family to gradually reduce the inappropriate medications, and within 3 months, Miss Chen, Sr. was back to playing bridge and reading newspapers. The Henderson family in Alabama, whose mother had died under suspicious circumstances 6 months before we opened our investigation. While we couldn't bring their mother back, our evidence had led to criminal convictions and a $4.7 million settlement that the family used to establish a memorial fund for other abuse. Each case represented more than just legal victory. It represented validation for families who had been gaslit, dismissed, and silenced when they tried to protect their loved ones. "Senator Mitchell," I addressed the committee chairman, "these cases demonstrate that elder abuse isn't just about individual bad actors. It's about systematic failures in oversight, regulation, and accountability that create environments where abuse flourishes." Senator Mitchell, a distinguished woman in her 70s, whose own mother had experienced nursing home neglect, leaned forward intently. "Ms. Martinez, what would you say to families who are currently struggling with concerns about their loved ones' care, but feel powerless to address those concerns. I thought about my own journey, about the months of self-doubt and isolation I'd endured before learning to trust my instincts. I would tell them that their concerns are valid, their observations matter, and they have more power than they realize. Document everything, ask hard questions, and never let anyone convince you that accepting substandard care is just part of growing old. After the hearing, I was approached by Dr. James Morrison, a geriatrician from Johns Hopkins, who had been following our work. Miss Martinez, I'd like to discuss a research proposal that could revolutionize how we approach elder care monitoring. Dr. Morrison explained his vision for a technological solution that would complement our enforcement efforts. We're developing wearable devices that can monitor elderly residents' vital signs, movement patterns, and medication compliance in real time. The data would be transmitted to a central monitoring system that could detect signs of abuse or neglect automatically. The concept was brilliant, using technology to provide 24/7 oversight in situations where human monitoring had failed. What would you need to implement this system? I asked. Federal funding for the initial deployment, regulatory approval from the FDA, and partnerships with facilities willing to participate in pilot programs. Your office's endorsement would carry significant weight with both legislators and facility administrators. I immediately saw the potential. Technology couldn't replace human compassion and proper staffing, but it could provide an early warning system for families and regulators when things went wrong. Send me a detailed proposal, I said. I'll present it to our technology advisory board next month. That evening, I returned to my apartment in Georgetown, a modest 2-bedroom place that felt palatial compared to my old studio in Portland. The walls were covered with photographs from advocacy events, thank you letters from families, and newspaper clippings documenting our victories. But the most precious item was Grandpa's chess set, positioned on a small table by the window where the evening light fell across the carved wooden pieces. I was setting up the board for my nightly game, a ritual I'd maintained even though Grandpa was no longer there to play with me. When my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from Oregon. Rachel? This is Tom Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's son. I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted you to hear this from my family. My heart clenched with fear. Mrs. Patterson had become like a grandmother to me, and at 73, any late-night call about her health terrified me. Mom's fine, Tom said quickly, recognizing my silence. Actually, she's more than fine. She wanted me to call because she has news she thinks you'll want to hear immediately. Relief flooded through me. What kind of news? The Theodore Martinez Foundation just received its largest donation ever. $12 million from an anonymous donor who specified that the money should be used to expand the advocacy program nationally. But that's not the best part. Tom's voice grew excited. The donor included a letter explaining their motivation. They said they had been planning to place their elderly father in a Golden Years facility, but your investigation made them realize the signs of systematic abuse they'd been overlooking at his current care center. They moved him to a better facility, and he's thriving now. The donation is their way of thanking you for saving their father's life. The impact of our work continued to ripple outward in ways I could never have anticipated. A family I'd never met, an elderly man I'd never seen. A crisis averted because someone had learned to recognize warning signs we'd publicized. It was exactly the kind of preventive success Grandpa had envisioned. There's more, Tom continued. Mom asked me to tell you that 3 more families contacted the foundation this week. They're all dealing with concerns about facilities in the Golden Years network that reopened under new names after the federal investigation. This was the challenge we'd been expecting. Corrupt facility owners didn't simply disappear when their companies were shut down. They reorganized under new corporate structures, hired different administrators, and resumed operations with cosmetic changes designed to evade detection. We're tracking 17 suspected shell companies across 11 states, I told Tom. These operators are sophisticated, but they tend to use the same business models and make the same mistakes. We'll catch them. After hanging up, I called Detective Chen, who had been promoted to head Oregon's Elder Abuse Task Force following our successful collaboration. Sarah, I said when she answered, "We need to accelerate the tracking protocol for shell companies. The bad actors are regrouping faster than we anticipated." "Already on it," she replied. "We've been working with federal financial crimes investigators to map the corporate restructuring patterns. Some of these facilities are being funded by the same investment groups that backed the original Golden Years network." Detective Chen's voice took on a grim tone. "Rachel, we're dealing with people who see elderly residents as profit centers. Nothing more. They're not going to voluntarily reform their practices just because we shut down their previous operations. Then we keep shutting them down," I said. "Every facility we close, every operator we prosecute, every family we help, it all sends a message that elder abuse has consequences." The next morning brought news that validated our concerns. A facility in Nevada called Sunset Horizons, obviously a rebranding of the shuttered Sunset Manor network, had been reported for medication errors and understaffing by 3 separate families in the span of a week. I immediately contacted our Nevada field office and requested an emergency inspection. Within 48 hours, our investigators had documented serious violations and initiated proceedings to revoke the facility's license. But the Nevada case also revealed something troubling. The facility's administrator was Jennifer Walsh, Roberto's former business partner, who had escaped prosecution in the original case by claiming she was unaware of the systematic abuse. "She's testing our resolve," I told my chief investigator during our weekly briefing. "Walsh thinks she can operate with impunity as long as she stays below our radar and doesn't repeat the exact same violations that got her colleagues convicted." "What's our response strategy?" he asked. "Zero tolerance. We investigate every complaint, document every violation, and prosecute every case where we find criminal activity. These operators need to understand that changing their corporate names doesn't change our commitment to protecting elderly residents." The Nevada case became a model for our evolved enforcement strategy. Instead of waiting for systematic abuse to develop, we intervened at the first signs of problematic patterns. The facility was closed within 6 weeks. Its residents were transferred to properly managed care centers, and Jennifer Walsh faced federal charges for conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The quick action sent shockwaves through the elder care industry. Facility operators who had been planning similar shell company strategies suddenly realized that our enforcement network was more sophisticated and responsive than they'd anticipated. Within 3 months, we received tips about suspicious facilities in 8 states, all connected to former Golden Years administrators attempting to restart their operations under new identities. Each tip led to investigations, and each investigation uncovered evidence of the same systematic corner-cutting and abuse that had characterized the original network. "They're not learning," Dr. Reeves observed during one of our quarterly advisory board meetings. "These operators seem genuinely shocked that anyone would prioritize elderly residents' welfare over profit margins." Her comment highlighted something fundamental about the people we were pursuing. They operated in a moral universe where vulnerable elderly people were resources to be exploited rather than human beings deserving of dignity and care. "That's exactly why our work matters," I replied. "We're not just changing regulations or prosecuting criminals. We're establishing a new standard for how society treats its most vulnerable members." The second anniversary of Grandpa's death fell on a crisp October day that reminded me of the afternoon I'd walked into Henderson and Associates for the will reading. I flew back to Portland for a memorial service at the community center, where over 200 people gathered to honor his memory and celebrate the movement he'd inspired. Mrs. Patterson, now 75, but still sharp and energetic, delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of what we'd accomplished. Theodore Martinez proved that one person's refusal to accept injustice can transform an entire system. But more than that, he showed us that love and courage can triumph over greed and indifference. The memorial service featured speakers I never could have imagined 2 years earlier. The Attorney General of Oregon, who announced new state legislation inspired by our federal reforms. Dr. Morrison from Johns Hopkins, who revealed that the technological monitoring system was being tested in 12 facilities across 3 states. And Patricia Williams from Phoenix, who had become a victim advocate in Arizona and helped establish elder abuse prevention programs in 6 southwestern states. But the most moving speaker was Margaret Thompson, the 82-year-old widow whose husband had died at Golden Valley Assisted Living. She had used part of her civil settlement to fund a scholarship program for nursing students who committed to working in geriatric care. "James would be so proud," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. "He always said that the best way to honor the dead is to protect the living." This foundation, this movement, this commitment to elder justice, it's James's legacy as much as Theodore's. As the memorial service concluded, I found myself surrounded by families whose lives had been changed by our advocacy work. Some were families we'd helped directly, others were people who had been inspired to start their own local advocacy groups, and still others were elderly residents themselves who wanted to thank us for giving them voices in decisions about their own care. An elderly man named Franklin Moore approached me with tears in his eyes. "Ms. Martinez, I wanted you to know that your grandfather saved my life without ever meeting me." Franklin explained that he'd been scheduled to move into a Golden Years facility in Washington state just days before our investigation became public. "My daughter saw the news coverage and decided to research the facility more carefully. She discovered they'd been cited for the same kinds of violations you'd found in Oregon." He gripped my hands tightly. "Instead, I moved into a community-based care program where I have my own apartment, but access to medical support when I need it. I'm thriving, Miss Martinez. I'm 89 years old, and I'm thriving because your grandfather's courage gave my daughter the knowledge she needed to protect me." Stories like Franklin's reminded me that our work had prevented countless tragedies that would never make headlines because they never happened. Elderly residents who received proper care because facilities were being monitored more carefully, families who asked better questions because they'd learned to recognize warning signs, operators who maintained higher standards because they knew violations would have consequences. The prevention cases were invisible successes, but they represented the truest measure of our impact. For every case we prosecuted, there were dozens of cases we'd prevented through education, advocacy, and the simple knowledge that someone was watching. As I flew back to Washington that evening, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed. The inheritance that had seemed overwhelming 2 years ago had become the foundation for a national movement. The family relationships that had been destroyed by truth-telling had been replaced by chosen family bonds, forged through shared commitment to justice. Most importantly, the scared, isolated young woman who had been excluded from a will reading had found her purpose, her voice, and her power to create meaningful change in the world. Grandpa's final gift hadn't just been vindication, it had been transformation, turning his legacy of love and justice into a force that would protect vulnerable elderly people for generations to come. And I would spend the rest of my life ensuring that his faith in me had been justified. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.